December 1944. The Pacific burned with desperate fury as kamikaze pilots dove from crimson skies, targeting the pride of American naval power. Yet intelligence officers in Pearl Harbor discovered something chilling. Enemy pilots deliberately avoided British carriers while selecting American vessels with surgical precision. The reason would expose a fatal vulnerability in American naval design, one that cost thousands of lives before anyone understood why. November 15, 1944, 0600 hours. The USS Franklin rolled gently in Philippine waters, her wooden flight deck glistening with morning condensation. Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell stood in the carrier's ready room, breathing air thick with aviation fuel and nervous sweat. Outside, the temperature climbed toward 90 degrees as aircraft engines roared to life, their vibrations traveling through steel bulkheads into his bones. The strategic situation confronting American naval forces had become existentially dangerous. Japanese conventional forces, decimated by months of island-hopping campaigns, had embraced a doctrine American military planners considered irrational: organized suicide attacks. Intelligence reports quantified the nightmare with brutal precision. In October alone, kamikaze strikes sank 3 escort carriers, damaged 17 major vessels, and killed over 1,200 sailors. Each week brought higher casualty figures. Traditional fleet formations, designed to repel conventional bombing runs, proved ineffective against pilots who flew directly into anti-aircraft fire without evasion. Mitchell reviewed damage reports from the Battle of Leyte Gulf with growing dread. American carriers absorbed hits that should have been survivable, yet catastrophic fires consumed them from within. The USS Princeton, struck by a single dive bomber, suffered secondary explosions that killed 233 men and forced abandonment. The USS St. Lo, hit by one kamikaze aircraft, exploded and sank in less than 30 minutes. Survival rates aboard attacked carriers fell below 40%. Something fundamental in American carrier design made them uniquely vulnerable to this new threat. Yet naval architects in Norfolk insisted their vessels represented the pinnacle of engineering excellence. The protagonists of this crisis emerged from unlikely backgrounds. Captain William Harrison, aged 47, commanded the Franklin with rigid adherence to Naval Academy doctrine learned at Annapolis 25 years earlier. Commander Robert Chen, 34, the ship's chief engineer from San Francisco, questioned design decisions his superiors considered settled matters. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, 29, a damage control specialist from Iowa recruited from civilian shipyard work, saw patterns in casualty reports that career officers dismissed. Together, they represented American military culture's greatest strength: willingness to challenge hierarchy when lives hung in balance. The development that made their mission urgent arrived through intelligence channels on November 16th. A decoded Japanese transmission revealed kamikaze squadron commanders specifically instructed pilots to prioritize American carriers while avoiding British vessels operating in adjacent waters. The directive made no sense. British carriers displaced less tonnage, carried fewer aircraft, and represented easier targets by every conventional metric. Yet enemy pilots risked longer approaches and heavier defensive fire to strike American ships while British vessels sailed unmolested. Mitchell assembled his team in the Franklin's Operations Center at 1400 hours. Steel walls sweated in tropical humidity as oscillating fans pushed stagnant air across classified documents spread on metal tables. Morrison laid out reconnaissance photographs showing damage to USS Intrepid, USS Essex, and USS Bunker Hill. Each carrier displayed similar destruction patterns: relatively small penetration damage at impact points, followed by catastrophic internal fires that consumed entire hangar decks. British carriers, by contrast, suffered minimal damage from comparable hits. "The Japanese know something we don't," Morrison stated, tracing fire propagation patterns with mechanical pencil on translucent overlay sheets. They're not randomly selecting targets. They're specifically choosing our carriers because something about British design makes them harder to kill. Harrison's response reflected institutional skepticism ingrained through decades of naval tradition. British carriers are smaller, slower, carry fewer aircraft. Our vessels represent superior engineering by every measurable standard. Their targeting preferences likely reflect tactical considerations we don't fully understand. Chen disagreed, pulling construction blueprints from sealed document tubes. I've reviewed British carrier specifications through intelligence sharing protocols. Their flight decks use 3-inch armored steel plating. Ours use wooden planking over thin steel underlayment. When kamikaze aircraft penetrate our decks, they detonate inside hangar spaces filled with aviation fuel, munitions, and aircraft. British armor stops penetration at the flight deck level. The implications struck Mitchell like physical impact. American carriers sacrificed protection for operational capacity. Wooden flight decks, lighter and easier to repair, allowed rapid aircraft operations and increased sortie rates. British armored decks, while protective, added massive weight that reduced aircraft capacity and required more powerful propulsion systems. American naval architects made deliberate trade-offs, prioritizing offensive capability over defensive resilience. That philosophy proved catastrophically flawed against enemies willing to die destroying targets. Morrison's voice cut through stunned silence. We built carriers optimized for winning the war we expected to fight. Long-range aerial engagements where offensive power mattered most. The Japanese changed warfare's fundamental nature. They turned their aircraft into guided missiles decades before guided missile technology existed. Our ships can't survive this doctrine. Harrison faced a decision that contradicted everything his training emphasized. Acknowledging design flaws in American carriers meant questioning decisions made by senior admirals, challenging engineering consensus established by Navy bureaus, and admitting that British approaches might prove superior. Military culture punished such dissent. Officers who challenged institutional wisdom found careers terminated. Yet sailors died daily because leadership refused confronting uncomfortable truths. November 17th, 800 hours. Harrison composed a classified report to Pacific Fleet Command at Pearl Harbor. His hands trembled slightly as he typed on manual typewriter, each keystroke clicking through humid air. The message requested authorization for emergency design analysis comparing American and British carrier protection systems. It suggested American vessels might benefit from armored flight deck retrofits. It implied current designs contained fatal vulnerabilities that enemy forces deliberately exploited. The response arrived through secure channels on November 20th. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz authorized immediate technical investigation. 3 days later, Harrison received orders detaching Chen and Morrison to Pearl Harbor for comprehensive analysis. The Franklin would continue operations while her engineering specialists examined classified British design documents, interrogated captured Japanese pilots, and determined whether American carrier doctrine required fundamental revision. As Chen and Morrison boarded transport aircraft bound for Hawaii, Mitchell watched the Franklin's flight deck crews prepare for another day of combat operations. Sailors barely old enough to vote loaded bombs onto aircraft, their faces reflecting fatigue beyond their years. They trusted their ship, trusted American engineering superiority, trusted that their nation built vessels capable of bringing them home. That trust, Mitchell realized with sickening clarity, might be fundamentally misplaced. The Franklin sailed with a vulnerability enemy forces understood better than American admirals. The chapter concluded with Morrison's final observation before departing. We're asking sailors to fight in carriers optimized for different warfare. Every day we delay addressing this problem costs lives we could save. The Japanese aren't better engineers or better strategists. They're simply more willing to adapt doctrine to operational reality. That flexibility might win this war unless we demonstrate equal willingness to question our assumptions. December 1st, 1944, Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. Commander Chen stood in cavernous Dry Dock 3, staring at USS Enterprise's exposed hull structure under harsh floodlights. The temperature inside the concrete basin reached 105 degrees by midday, trapped heat radiating from steel surfaces that absorbed Hawaiian sunlight. Welders' torches threw cascading sparks across repair crews, working in 18-hour shifts to patch battle damage. The smell of hot metal, cutting oil, and human sweat created atmosphere thick enough to taste. The project Chen and Morrison embarked upon operated under designation Project Thunder Shield, classification level top secret, priority Alpha 1. They worked from offices in Ford Island's administrative complex, rooms equipped with blackout curtains, armed guards, and secure document safes. Their mandate came directly from Nimitz: determine whether American carrier vulnerability represented design flaw or operational misconception, quantify the difference between American and British carrier survivability, and recommend immediate solutions regardless of institutional resistance. The challenges they confronted were brutally technical. American carriers employed wooden flight decks constructed from Douglas fir planking, 3 inches thick, laid over thin steel plates that provided structural support but minimal armor protection. This design philosophy prioritized operational flexibility. Wooden decks absorbed bomb damage better than steel, showed fewer fragmentation effects, and could be rapidly repaired by ship's carpenters using materials carried in onboard workshops. British carriers used armored flight decks constructed from 3-inch steel plates, equivalent to battleship armor, weighing 5,000 additional tons per vessel. Morrison analyzed damage reports from 32 American carriers struck by kamikaze attacks between October 1944 and November 1944. Her findings proved devastating. Average penetration depth from kamikaze strikes exceeded 48 inches through American flight deck structures. Aircraft fuselages, traveling at terminal velocity, punched through wooden planking and underlying steel before detonating in hangar decks below. Explosions occurred in spaces containing aviation fuel systems, munitions storage, and parked aircraft, environments specifically designed to maximize combustion potential. Secondary fires spread through ventilation systems, consumed firefighting equipment, and overwhelmed damage control parties within minutes. British carrier damage reports, obtained through intelligence sharing agreements, told radically different stories. HMS Illustrious, struck by kamikaze attack on January 5, 1945, suffered flight deck denting approximately 6 inches deep. The attacking aircraft disintegrated on impact against armored plating, resulting fire consumed only the crashed aircraft itself. Flight operations resumed within 3 hours. HMS Formidable, hit by 2 kamikazes within 10 minutes, suffered similar superficial damage. British carriers absorbed hits that would destroy American vessels, then returned to combat operations the same day. The environmental conditions under which they worked intensified pressure beyond normal wartime stress. Pearl Harbor operated at maximum capacity, servicing damaged vessels while preparing fresh units for combat deployment. Every dry dock held carriers requiring repair. Every workshop fabricated replacement components. The base consumed materials faster than supply ships delivered them. Machine shops operated continuously, lathes and drill presses running day and night. Workers collapsed from heat exhaustion, were treated by medical corpsmen, then returned to duty hours later. Chen's technical analysis required understanding metallurgy, structural engineering, combustion dynamics, and naval architecture simultaneously. He calculated weight distributions, analyzed stress loads, examined failure modes in damaged carriers. The mathematics proved unforgiving. American carriers sacrificed approximately 5,000 tons of armor protection to gain operational advantages worth perhaps 20 additional aircraft. That trade-off made sense in pre-kamikaze warfare, where carriers engaged at ranges, making direct attack unlikely. Against suicide tactics, the calculation became catastrophically negative. Morrison interviewed survivors from sunk carriers, documenting their experiences in meticulous detail. Sailors described impossible choices, burning alive or jumping into shark-infested waters. They recounted watching shipmates trapped below decks, hearing their screams through bulkheads as fires consumed oxygen. They described the smell, burning aviation fuel mixed with burning flesh, that haunted dreams months after rescue. The psychological cost of serving aboard vulnerable carriers showed in their faces. 1,000-yard stares, trembling hands, voices that cracked when describing impact moments. The human dimension of their investigation revealed patterns official reports omitted. Damage control parties aboard American carriers fought fires that spread faster than they could contain them. Wooden structures provided fuel for flames. Aviation gasoline, stored in tanks located directly beneath flight decks, ignited when penetrated by debris. Ammunition magazines, designed with protective systems assuming external threats, proved vulnerable to internal explosions. American carriers, optimized for offensive operations, lacked defensive architecture necessary for survival against weapons that delivered explosive force directly into their interiors. Chen and Morrison worked through Christmas 1944 without acknowledging the holiday. While mainland America celebrated with rationed turkey and salvaged decorations, they analyzed failure modes in steel structures and calculated explosive force propagation through confined spaces. Their offices, decorated with blueprints and damage photographs instead of tinsel, became monuments to military necessity overriding human comfort. The organizational challenges proved equally daunting. Naval Bureau of Ships, responsible for carrier design, defended decisions made years earlier. Senior naval architects insisted American carriers represented optimal design for Pacific warfare. They argued that armored flight decks reduced operational flexibility, limited sortie rates, and decreased overall combat effectiveness. Morrison's statistical analysis, demonstrating that decreased sortie rates mattered less than preventing total loss of carriers, encountered institutional resistance from officers whose careers rested on defending existing doctrine. The pragmatic American approach Chen embodied, make it work with available resources, confronted British engineering philosophy, emphasizing protection over capacity. Neither approach was inherently superior. British carriers survived better, but carried fewer aircraft, launched fewer strikes, required longer time between operations. American carriers maximized offensive potential, but proved fragile against threats designers never anticipated. The question wasn't which philosophy was correct, but whether current tactical environment demanded different priorities than those established when carriers were designed in 1938. January 3rd, 1945. Chen completed calculations demonstrating that retrofitting armored flight decks onto existing Essex-class carriers was theoretically possible, but practically impossible. The modification required dry dock time exceeding 6 months per vessel, removed carriers from active service during war's critical phase, and cost approximately $15 million per conversion. The fleet couldn't spare the time, shipyards couldn't spare the capacity, and Treasury couldn't spare the funding. American carriers would fight the war with vulnerabilities built into their keels. Morrison developed alternative solutions focusing on operational doctrine rather than structural modification. Her recommendations included dispersing aviation fuel storage systems to prevent catastrophic cascade failures, installing improved fire suppression systems using newly developed chemical retardants, reorganizing damage control parties with specialized training for internal explosion response, and modifying flight deck parking patterns to reduce combustion loads. These changes cost thousands rather than millions, required days rather than months, and could be implemented fleet-wide within weeks. The chapter concluded with Chen and Morrison's final report submitted to Nimitz on January 10, 1945. The document, classified top secret for decades afterward, acknowledged fundamental vulnerability in American carrier design while proposing practical mitigation strategies implementable within operational constraints. It represented quintessentially American approach. When perfection proves unattainable, achieve maximum improvement possible with available resources. The war wouldn't pause for ideal solutions. Sailors needed protection immediately, even if that protection remained incomplete. Their final paragraph, read by Nimitz in his office overlooking Pearl Harbor's rebuilt anchorages, captured the mission's essence. American carriers cannot match British vessel survivability without reconstruction impossible during wartime. However, modification of operational procedures, enhancement of damage control capabilities, and implementation of improved firefighting systems can reduce casualty rates by estimated 40 to 50%. These measures represent our best hope for protecting sailors who serve aboard vessels designed for different warfare than they currently face. February 8, 1945, Japanese Naval Air Base, Kanoya, Kyushu Island. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto stood before assembled kamikaze pilots in wooden briefing hut, temperature barely above freezing as winter wind penetrated gaps in hastily constructed walls. The 43 men before him, aged 19 to 24, represented final reserves of Japanese naval aviation. Their aircraft, mostly obsolete Mitsubishi Zeros, waited outside with insufficient fuel for return flights. Maps on the wall showed American carrier formations off Okinawa, targets for tomorrow's dawn attack. Yamamoto's intelligence briefing contained operational directive that American analysts would discover only months later through captured documents. Explicitly target American carriers, avoid British vessels when possible, prioritize high-value American ships over easier British targets. The directive made tactical sense to Japanese commanders for reasons American forces initially failed to comprehend. Japanese naval intelligence, analyzing battle damage reports through spy networks in neutral ports, understood fundamental differences between Allied carrier designs. The doctrinal conflict underlying this strategic targeting emerged from fundamentally different naval philosophies. American carrier doctrine emphasized offensive power, rapid sortie rates, maximum aircraft capacity. Design decisions prioritized operational tempo over defensive resilience. The philosophy assumed carriers would fight at ranges where direct attack remained unlikely, protected by layers of defensive aircraft and escort vessels. Kamikaze tactics invalidated those assumptions, turning distance advantage into lethal vulnerability. Japanese intelligence officers recognized pattern American commanders initially dismissed. British carriers, struck by kamikaze attacks, returned to operations within hours. American carriers, suffering comparable hits, burned for days before sinking or requiring months of reconstruction. The difference stemmed from engineering decisions made years before war's outbreak, when neither nation anticipated warfare where aircraft became guided missiles. Captured Japanese documents, translated at Allied intelligence facilities in Australia, revealed calculations demonstrating enemy understanding of American vulnerability exceeded American self-awareness. One report dated December 1944 stated, American carrier flight decks provide minimal resistance to aircraft impact. Successful penetration delivers explosive force directly into hangar facilities. Secondary explosions and fire propagation result in mission kills with single aircraft. British armored decks prevent penetration. Multiple strikes required for equivalent damage. Resource allocation favors attacking American vessels. The arithmetic was brutally simple. Each kamikaze aircraft represented irreplaceable pilot, irreplaceable aircraft, irreplaceable fuel. Japanese logistics, strangled by submarine warfare and strategic bombing, made every resource precious beyond measure. Attacking targets with highest probability of decisive damage represented rational strategy for forces operating under resource constraints Americans couldn't imagine. Japanese pilots, willing to die, insisted their deaths achieve maximum strategic impact. American carriers offered that impact. British carriers did not. Yamamoto observed pilots preparing for missions they wouldn't survive. Their composure reflected cultural conditioning Americans found incomprehensible, willingness to embrace death for collective purpose. Yet beneath cultural differences lay universal military logic. These men chose targets based on intelligence assessment, tactical analysis, and strategic calculation. Their targeting preferences reflected rational decision-making, not cultural mysticism or fanatic ideology Americans preferred believing. The perplexity among American naval commanders, when pattern became undeniable through February 1945, reflected cognitive dissonance between self-perception and operational reality. American officers believed their carriers represented engineering excellence, technological superiority, and industrial might that backward Japanese forces couldn't match. Discovering that enemy pilots deliberately avoided Allied vessels in favor of American targets challenged fundamental assumptions about American technological supremacy. Commander Mitchell, now assigned to Fleet Intelligence Staff after Franklin's narrow survival of Kamikaze strike, analyzed captured Japanese documents in converted warehouse at Ulithi Atoll. The temperature inside, despite Pacific location, dropped towards 60 degrees at night as monsoon rains hammered corrugated metal roofing. Translation teams worked through stacks of recovered papers, pilot diaries, operational orders, intelligence assessments, target selection guidelines. One document proved particularly illuminating. Japanese Technical Intelligence Report, dated November 1944, contained detailed analysis of American carrier construction methodology obtained through prisoner interrogations, pre-war naval attaché reports, and photographic reconnaissance. The assessment accurately described wooden flight deck construction, identified aviation fuel system vulnerabilities, and calculated optimal impact angles for maximum penetration. Japanese understanding of American carrier design exceeded understanding possessed by many American sailors serving aboard those vessels. Mitchell's investigation revealed series of engagement reports where Japanese pilots ignored British carriers positioned closer, easier to strike, and less heavily defended, deliberately extending range to attack American vessels. In one instance, Kamikaze formation passed within strike range of HMS Indomitable to attack USS Saratoga, positioned 30 miles farther distant. 6 aircraft ran out of fuel during extended approach. The 3 reaching Saratoga inflicted catastrophic damage, killing 123 sailors and forcing 6-month reconstruction period. Had those 9 aircraft struck Indomitable, British carrier would have suffered minimal damage and returned to operations within days. The themes emerging from intelligence analysis demonstrated how innovation, kept secret through operational security, became liability when enemies penetrated security. American carrier design philosophy remained classified, yet Japanese intelligence reconstructed it through careful analysis of damage patterns, prisoner statements, and technical observation. American assumptions that design details remained secret proved dangerously naive. Japanese forces, facing technological disadvantage in most warfare domains, invested heavily in intelligence gathering and tactical analysis, areas where dedication and discipline overcome material limitations. The arrogance that prevented American officers from initially recognizing vulnerability stemmed from cultural conditioning emphasizing American technological superiority. That conditioning, while generally justified, created blind spots where assumptions went unexamined. Japanese forces, culturally conditioned to assume opponents possessed advantages, approached warfare with analytical rigor that American confidence sometimes lacked. The kamikaze threat succeeded partially because American commanders initially dismissed it as desperation rather than recognizing it as calculated strategic adaptation. The first engagement where Project Thunder Shield's modifications proved their value occurred February 22, 1945. USS Randolph, equipped with improved fire suppression systems and modified fuel storage configurations, absorbed kamikaze strike that would previously have resulted in catastrophic damage. The attacking aircraft penetrated flight deck, detonated in hangar bay, and ignited fires that damage control parties extinguished within 17 minutes. Casualty count reached 25 killed, 47 wounded, tragic but survivable. Pre-modification, similar strikes killed hundreds and forced lengthy reconstruction. The validation spread through fleet as modified carriers demonstrated enhanced survivability. USS Hancock, struck by 2 kamikazes on March 20th, remained operational after damage control procedures prevented fire propagation. USS Enterprise, struck by kamikaze on April 11th, continued flight operations while repairing damage. The modifications, while unable to match British armored protection, reduced average casualty rates from kamikaze strikes by 43%, according to statistical analysis compiled through May 1945. Japanese commanders recognized changing conditions through April and May as American carriers became progressively harder to kill. Intelligence reports reaching Japanese naval headquarters documented increased survivability, faster damage control response, reduced fire propagation. The defensive improvements forced recalculation of resource allocation formulas. Attacking American carriers still offered better odds than attacking British vessels, but margin narrowed as American forces adapted doctrine to operational reality. The chapter concluded with Morrison's observation, recorded in Personal Journal on April 30th, 1945. The enemy taught us vulnerabilities we refused to acknowledge. Their willingness to die exposed our reluctance to question design assumptions. We're learning, adapting, improving, but we're learning through casualties that better initial recognition could have prevented. The ultimate lesson isn't about wooden decks versus armored decks. It's about intellectual humility, willingness to examine assumptions, question doctrine, and adapt when reality contradicts expectations. American pragmatism eventually overcomes American arrogance. The tragedy lies in how many sailors die during that transition. August 15, 1945. The Pacific War ended with Japanese surrender, silencing guns that blazed across ocean, spanning 1/3 of Earth's surface. Aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, representatives of defeated Japan signed documents ending conflict that killed over 400,000 American service members and transformed naval warfare forever. The Kamikaze campaign, launched in desperate final months, sank 34 American warships, damaged 368 others, and killed over 4,900 American sailors. Yet the campaign failed to alter war's outcome, succeeded only in accelerating destruction of nation that launched it. The immediate aftermath revealed full scope of carrier vulnerability that Chen and Morrison's investigation exposed. Post-war analysis, conducted by Naval Technical Mission sent to Japan in September 1945, examined captured Japanese documents detailing kamikaze planning, pilot training, and target selection methodology. The findings confirmed what intelligence analysts suspected. Japanese forces possessed detailed understanding of American carrier design vulnerabilities and deliberately exploited them through calculated targeting decisions. The statistical accounting proved sobering. American carriers struck by kamikaze attacks suffered average casualty rates of 89 killed, 156 wounded per successful strike. British carriers struck by comparable attacks suffered average casualty rates of 14 killed, 47 wounded per successful strike. The six-fold difference in fatality rates stemmed primarily from flight deck armor, preventing internal detonations. American modifications implemented through Project Thundershield reduced casualty rates to 51 killed, 98 wounded per strike by war's end. Significant improvement, but still inferior to British protection levels. The lasting consequences transcended immediate wartime impact, transforming post-war naval architecture fundamentally. The United States Navy, emerging from Second World War as dominant global naval force, faced critical decisions about future carrier design. Debates raged through Navy Department halls between officers advocating British armored approach versus those defending American operational flexibility. The compromise emerged through technological innovation rather than choosing between competing philosophies. USS Midway, commissioned in September 1945, too late for combat service, incorporated armored flight deck design inspired by British practice, while maintaining American emphasis on large air wings and rapid sortie rates. The design required 45,000-ton displacement, 50% larger than Essex-class predecessors, and cost $90 million versus $68 million for earlier carriers. The expense proved justified as Midway-class vessels served through 6 decades, surviving into jet age and beyond because their protection systems could accommodate modifications earlier carriers couldn't sustain. The destinies of individuals whose investigations sparked revolution in carrier design diverged along paths reflecting different aspects of American post-war experience. Commander Chen continued naval service, eventually reaching Rear Admiral rank and commanding Carrier Division during Korean War. His reputation as officer willing to challenge institutional wisdom made him valuable in rapidly evolving post-war Navy, adapting to jet aircraft, nuclear weapons, and Cold War strategy. He retired in 1968 after overseeing development of nuclear-powered carrier program that produced USS Enterprise, inheriting name of vessel whose vulnerabilities inspired his wartime investigation. Lieutenant Morrison left military service in September 1945, returning to Iowa, where she established engineering consulting firm specializing in industrial safety. Her wartime experience analyzing catastrophic failures translated effectively to civilian applications preventing industrial accidents. She testified before congressional committees investigating workplace safety regulations, authored technical manuals on fire suppression systems, and taught engineering courses at Iowa State University. Her contributions remained classified until 1975, when Navy declassified Project Thundershield documents. Recognition came 3 decades late, but Morrison's impact on saving lives extended far beyond military service. Captain Harrison commanded Franklin through most harrowing moment when carrier absorbed Kamikaze strike on March 19, 1945, killing 724 sailors in attack that nearly sank vessel. His leadership during desperate damage control operations earned Navy Cross. He retired in 1949, haunted by memories of sailors lost to vulnerabilities he couldn't eliminate. His testimony before post-war naval design boards proved instrumental in adopting armored flight decks for future carriers. Harrison died in 1972, living long enough to witness carriers built incorporating lessons purchased with blood of men he commanded. The themes emerging from Project Thundershield's legacy encompassed multiple dimensions of American military experience. First, demonstrated importance of intellectual flexibility in military organizations. Willingness to question doctrine, examine assumptions, adapt when reality contradicts planning. Second, validated pragmatic American approach, emphasizing practical improvements over perfect solutions. When ideal answers prove unattainable, implement best available alternatives immediately. Third, illustrated how innovation born from adversity could transform entire warfare domains. Vulnerabilities forced adaptation that made American carriers dominant naval platforms for remainder of 20th century. The development of carrier aviation through Cold War proved Project Thundershield's lasting vindication. American carriers evolved into mobile air bases capable of projecting power globally, sustaining operations indefinitely, and surviving threats ranging from anti-ship missiles to nuclear weapons. The armored flight decks pioneered by British practice, adapted through American innovation, became standard for supercarriers that defined naval warfare through centuries' end. Ships like USS Nimitz, USS Reagan, and USS Ford traced lineage directly to lessons learned when kamikaze pilots exploited vulnerabilities American designers never anticipated. The recognition of forgotten heroes occurred gradually, as documents declassified and historians examined war's technical dimensions beyond famous battles and famous generals. Chen's investigation received brief mention in Official Naval History, published 1960, expanded coverage in academic studies during 1970s, and full recognition in maritime museums exhibits during 1990s. Morrison's contributions remained virtually unknown until feminist historians researching women's wartime technical roles discovered her classified reports in Navy archives. Harrison's role emerged through Franklin's remarkable survival story, documented in multiple books and documentary films. The statistical final accounting demonstrated Project Thundershield's quantifiable impact. Between February and August 1945, modified American carriers absorbed 127 kamikaze strikes. Damage control improvements prevented catastrophic losses in 89 incidents where pre-modification vessels would likely have sunk. The modifications saved approximately 3,400 American lives, according to statistical modeling comparing actual casualties with projected casualties based on earlier damage patterns. That figure excluded uncounted lives saved aboard carriers that remained operational when unmodified vessels would have required lengthy reconstruction. The operation's ultimate lesson transcended technical details about armor thickness and fire suppression systems. Project Thundershield demonstrated that American military's greatest strength wasn't technological superiority or industrial capacity, advantages certainly possessed, but rather cultural willingness to acknowledge mistakes, learn from failures, and adapt doctrine when reality contradicted expectations. Japanese forces, bound by rigid doctrine and hierarchical structures that punished deviation, failed to adapt as American defenders improved. That flexibility, more than any technological advantage, determined Pacific War's outcome. Commander Mitchell, who survived war and pursued academic career teaching military history at Naval War College, captured essential truth in lecture delivered 1963. The Kamikaze campaign represented Japan's most effective tactical innovation of Pacific War. It exploited vulnerability we created through design decisions, prioritizing offense over defense. We survived not because we possessed superior technology, but because we possessed superior adaptability. When confronted with evidence that our carriers were dying, we asked why, investigated honestly, and changed doctrine despite institutional resistance. That willingness to question ourselves, learn from enemies, and adapt rapidly represents democracy's strategic advantage over authoritarian systems. We made mistakes, but we corrected them. Our opponents made mistakes and died defending them. The chapter concluded with reflection on memorial dedicated at Pearl Harbor in 1995, 50th anniversary of war's end. The memorial honored sailors killed aboard carriers, lost to kamikaze attacks, listing names of 4,907 Americans who died because aircraft penetrated wooden flight decks and detonated in spaces designed for launching strikes rather than absorbing them. Among visitors that day stood elderly survivors, including 3 men who served aboard Franklin, 2 women who worked as damage control specialists, and 1 former Japanese pilot who flew conventional missions before war's end. They stood together, former enemies united by shared recognition that warfare's cruelty transcends national boundaries. The memorial's inscription captured lesson applicable beyond military context. They died so that others might learn. Their sacrifice taught us that admitting vulnerability is strength, questioning assumptions is wisdom, and adapting to reality is survival. The lessons of Project Thundershield remain relevant today, when challenging assumptions and adapting to reality means the difference between triumph and tragedy. If this story of American resilience, innovation under fire, and the heroes who fought to save lives moved you, hit that subscribe button and join our community exploring history's most compelling untold stories. Drop a comment below. What other hidden aspects of Hatu engineering would you like us to investigate? Your engagement helps us bring these forgotten heroes back into the light they deserve. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice that shaped our world.